Thank you for joining us for our featured craft talk by virtual visiting writer at Vermont Studio Center, Paisley Rekdal. Paisley Rekdal is the author of a book of essays, The Night of My Mother Met Bruce Lee, the hybrid photo text memoir, Intimate, and 5 books of poetry, A Crash of Rhinos, 6 Girls Without Pants, The Invention of the Kaleidoscope, Animal Eye, a finalist for the 2013 Kingsley Tufts Prize and winner of the UNT Rilke Prize, and Imaginary Vessels, finalist for the 2018 Kingsley Tufts Prize and the Washington State Book Award. Her newest work of nonfiction is a book-length essay, The Broken Country on Trauma, a Crime, and the Continuing Legacy of Vietnam. The new collection of poems, Nightingale, which rewrites many of the myths in Ovid's The Metamorphoses, was published in spring 2019. Appropriate or Appropriate, a Provocation, which examines cultural appropriation, is available now from W.W. Norton, and I highly recommend it. She was the guest editor for Best American Poetry 2020, and she is also a distinguished professor at the University of Utah, where she's zooming in from, which is very early for her, and I really appreciate it. And she is also the creator and editor of the community web project, Mapping Literary Utah and Mapping Salt Lake City. In 2017, she was named Utah's Poet Laureate and received a 2019 Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship. This morning, Paisley will be screen sharing for us, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks for being here, Paisley.
Thank you. So, good morning. It is a little early for me, but it's earlier still for the person in Seattle. So I'm sure you also are caffeinating as we speak. So today I'm going to be talking about syntax. And even though I'm going to be thinking specifically about poetry, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about will also be applicable to prose as well. I'm also a prose writer. I'm going to put in 2 terms that I'm going to refer to back and forth into the chat. Hypotaxis, Parataxis. And then I'm going to start sharing my screen. So hypotaxis and parataxis are 2 fancy sounding terms that in fact we use all the time. We just don't really know what we're doing necessarily. Hypotaxis is a form of, hypotaxis and parataxis are 2 ways of sort of making sentences. Hypotactic sentences are ones that have multiple clauses in them. They have usually a lot of stacked clauses and things like that. And parataxis is more, how do I describe it at 8 in the morning? Kind of as almost a stream of consciousness. I'll give you 2 examples of hypotaxis and then a couple of examples of parataxis. So a hypotactic sentence would go something like this. When I woke up this morning, I woke up late. I spoke to my husband and asked what he wanted to eat for dinner, and he replied that he would like me to go and get Thai food and perhaps da da da. So you can hear from the very beginning of that sentence, you know, when I woke up, I spoke to my husband and he said da da da. You can hear that there's actually an extraordinary number of different things happening. You could also have a sentence such as, when I was 5, I remember that my mother, comma, who originated from South Carolina, comma, told me a story about my uncle, comma, who blah, 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 blah. So you could also hear in that one, there's lots of different clauses that kind of refer back to a specific subject, but it becomes more about stacking information. There are hierarchies of information. I think that's really important to keep in mind. A hypotactic sentence is one that uses a lot of different types of relative or conditional clauses that are stacked in the reader's mind so that one thing takes precedence over another. Oftentimes these clauses you are serving to illuminate something about a subject, but because they are placed subordinately, they are subordinate clauses, we understand that information not to be the primary one that the reader needs to pay attention to. Parataxis is another way of writing a sentence, where you use a lot of things like conjunctions like and or buts and so. And instead of thinking about subordinating clauses, they think about creating a continual stream of information that would suggest a kind of equivalence. I went to the store and I bought milk and bread and eggs. And then I went to the liquor store and I bought a bottle of Strega and a carton of Picayunes. And then I went to the, movie theater and I sat down with my friend. As you could hear with that pileup of and, obviously a lot of different, things were done during this period of time. But in the mind of the speaker, it's a continual stream that does not suggest any kind of subordination or hierarchy of events. They just unfold. Again, to sort of hit with the difference between hypotaxis and parataxis, if hypotaxis suggests complex amounts of information that suggest hierarchies and subordination, they ask us to pay attention to the relationship between things. What is more important than another thing? Parataxis asks us also to consider a relationship, but not in terms of subordination, but in terms of equivalence. So what does this mean for poetry? And what does this mean, more importantly, for our writing? So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show you a couple of poems. I want us to focus in on one poem first, and you're going to have a little writing exercise, in fact. It's not even really a writing exercise so much as a counting exercise. So this is a poem that I really love. It's called St. Kevin and the Blackbird by Sheamus Heaney. And if you don't know who Sheamus Heaney was, he was a wonderful Irish poet, winner of the Nobel Prize. Some of his famous books are, North. He did a wonderful translation of Beowulf as well. But what I want you to do is to pay attention to syntax here. And as I'm reading the poem, try to determine, I'll back up and say one thing before I read this poem. When I talk about hypotaxis and parataxis, I make it sound as if they're two very distinct forms of syntax that don't actually cohere. But oftentimes we move between the hypotactic and the paratactic, especially if we have long, complex sentences. So one kind of conversation we're going to have at some point is, where do we move from hypotaxis to parataxis? But when I read this poem, what I want you to do is start to count up the conjunctions, the ands, the so's, the buts. I want you particularly to count the number of ands. And then then we'll go back and we'll sort of figure out what's going on here. Can we characterize it as hypotaxis, parataxis, both? Where does it change? St. Kevin and the Blackbird. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell, but the cell is narrow, so one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked, neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he? Self-forgetful, or in agony all the time from the neck on out down through his hurting forearms? Are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head? Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labor and not to seek reward, he prays a prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name. So I want you to pay attention to the number of ands, maybe buts, the conjunctions, okay, the paratactical kinds of conjunctions. Count up as many as you can. It's okay if you don't get them all right. And then we'll start talking about the poem a little bit. Okay, I'm going to stop you. It's not a crucial thing. Before I ask you to tell me the number that you came up with just for the conjunction and, I want to point something out going back to hypotaxis and parataxis. One of the ways that, if you guys never studied grammar, one of the ways you can sort of tell a hypotactic sentence and conditional clauses and subordinate clauses, relative clauses, things like that, are when we have things that start with the when, while, things like that. It's a clause fragment of a sentence that starts with those things. Also, the participial of the phrase, something that ends with ing. Finding himself linked into the eternal network of life, something like that. Those become signals of this is subordinate information because it's not the main clause of the sentence. It's not the main activity or verb. Okay, so let's talk about how many people. What did people get? You can put it in the chat. Like, how many ands did you guys get? Anyone? All right, we got. Yeah. 12, 13. Yeah. 13, 14. If you count the title. Exactly. Yeah. Excellent. This is a lot, right? So here we've got a lot of this, a lot of these sorts of paratactical kinds of conjunctions here. And the question is sort of why. We also have a tremendous amount of hypotaxis though, too. We have the ways in which we first run into the saint. So first, I'm going to talk about the very first sentence, which is also the first line of the poem, which is paratactical. And then there was Saint Kevin and the blackbird. And pause that. But then we get this run-on long sentence. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell, but the cell is narrow. So one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. So here's an example of a sentence that uses both parataxis and hypotaxis. It uses hypotaxis in the very beginning of the sentence. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out, inside a cell, but the cell is narrow. So one turned up palm. We get a whole pile up of information that unfolds around the ways in which Saint Kevin is kneeling, the way in which his body is actually contorted in space. But one question is why? So unfortunately, this is one of those things where it'd be easier to have a conversation in person. I could really ask you and you guys could raise your hands and talk. And you're more than welcome to throw this in the chat about why you think this is happening. But for time and clarity's sake and quickness of ease, I will sort of talk about why I think it's happening. We have to imagine what Saint Kevin is actually doing here. So Saint Kevin is in a cell. And what's going on is that we have to imagine his body unfolding or folding into itself at every single moment in time. The saint is kneeling, his arms are stretched out. And then suddenly, instead of thinking about his arms, we have to think about the cell. So it's inside the cell, but the cell is narrow. So one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands. I'm going to pause there for a moment. One of the things that becomes important there is we have to start thinking about the physical agony that Kevin is himself in. This is obviously not a comfortable position. We have to imagine the space as increasingly becoming cramped so that we have to see his arm out this window. The syntax begins to actually mirror this. The subordination of all of these clauses, the pileup of this information adds to the burden in the reader's mind, just as the burden of Kevin's own body starts to accumulate in the weight of this moment. He is trying to fit himself into a space. Then we get to the paratactical moment. When a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. The question is, why not just says, why doesn't Heaney just say, when a blackbird lands and lays in it, settling down to nest? Well, one of the reasons is that suddenly we're stretching out this moment of time. Parataxis, going back to that, suggests a kind of equivalency instead of a subordinated or hierarchical information list of information. Suddenly we've got this extension of time. We have to imagine the blackbird doing two activities, one that is not more important than the other. And it is settling down and laying in the poem of St. Kevin. By doing this, it also asks the reader to think of these two moments in time, not speed over them. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. So here we've got another moment where we start with something like a little pile up of information, and then the syntax actually pulls out and extends to give us that sense of time again. But Kevin is feeling all of the parts of this bird: warm eggs, small breast, tucked neat head and claws. And this is the crucial bit, finding himself linked into the network of eternal life is moved to pity. So why does Kevin do what he wants to do? Why is Kevin essentially holding this blackbird? Because essentially at this moment, he finds himself part of an equivalent stretch of time in nature. He is linked into the network of eternal life itself. And he's moved to pity by that. So now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks. And again, we get the sense of time extending through the paratactical pileup of ands, sun and rain, until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. This is a poem about sort of two things. It's about physical agony, and it's also about the connection that we might have with other people. The hypotactic moments, I think, extend this sense of being both connected to other things, but also that sense of agony. The paratactical moments not only give us that long stretch of time that also suggests the endurance that Kevin himself is having to go through in order to protect this bird, but also suggests that perhaps Kevin, in his own awareness of how he's linked to other people, does not see himself as hierarchically above or subordinately below. There is an equivalent relationship to this bird. And just as he has to go through all of the moments of time with the bird, he is St. Kevin and the blackbird. There's another thing that's happening, I think, just in this first part of the poem, really interesting to me. We don't just begin with "there was St. Kevin and the blackbird" or "here is St. Kevin and the blackbird." We start with "and." This moment that suggests that there's also a connective tissue between this poem and some other narrative that has just taken place. Exactly, media res. We have this sense that just as St. Kevin himself is part of a network of eternal life, there's also potentially a network of eternal storytelling going on here. We just weren't witness to the first thing that started this. So it's a great way of linking this poem maybe to our understanding of other saints' lives, to the rest of, Heaney's own work, and that appears in the book. But it also is a continuation of the strategy that Heaney has actually used within the poem itself. St. Kevin becomes part of this bird by protecting it, holding it, but he's also part of this network of poetry itself. And we get back to that with the second part of this poem. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. And this is an important moment for me too, because up to this point, we've had to sort of, think about and focus in on Kevin as an object outside there, maybe as an object of our own pity. But now, Heaney reminds us that, in fact, this is, of course, an imagined scenario. It's a poem. So asks and invites the reader to connect herself into the poem by imagining being her own body, being the body of Kevin. And just as Kevin is himself had to imagine the experience of the bird, thus connecting himself to the bird and extending that physical and emotional labor, we now are being invited to do that same sort of thing. And then we are asked a series of questions, shorter questions that kind of become longer in their syntactical movement. But the questions boil down to one or two things. Is he in agony all the time? Or does he become part of this network to the point where he becomes self-forgetful? Is he still in pain? Or does he manage to kind of rise above this in some way? Is there distance in his head? Has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Has he become numb? Has he risen above this, or is he just in agony all the time? And this is a really interesting last moment. To labor and not to seek reward. He prays a prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name. There's an utter erasure of self. And I think it's not a big surprise that we go back to that sort of paratactical moment, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name. All of these things become something that become identities that are shucked off, just as there's no hierarchical or subordinate relationship between him and these natural things in the poem. These identities that would suggest the possibility of hierarchy, that would also suggest the possibility of physical pain in the awareness of their identities and their difference, get erased entirely. It doesn't come without some sort of cost. His body makes this prayer entirely. He forgets self, he forgets the bird, but again, he also forgets the river's name. He enters into a space in which St. Kevin himself ceases to be St. Kevin. That can be both a wonderful thing and maybe kind of a terrifying proposition too, to find oneself completely linked into this eternal network of life. But that's essentially what Heaney is arguing, to get to that point of radical connection, that radical equivalence that Parataxis sort of suggests in its endurance of time and its continuation of self into other. We also lose the boundaries of self that may give us some also sense of identity, comfort, and belonging to oneself. I want to move very quickly to a different kind of paratactical work, and then we'll talk about hypotaxis again. We'll talk about the one of the things that I like about that Sheamus Heaney poem and the ways in which hypotaxis and parataxis work is that it gives, when we work in syntactical modes like this, we enhance the argument that the poem or the piece of writing itself makes. We enhance what is at stake. We create a space in which the reader enters into an almost mimetic experience. When Heaney is trying to describe St. Kevin's own discomfort, he makes the reader completely but subtly aware of small shifts in time as they unfold bit by bit. It's a way of extending, obviously, discomfort, but it's also a way of extending the image of the bird, just how much time it would take for a bird to be hatched and fledged and flown. So it's a way of building character, it's a way of setting scene, and it's a way of enhancing, again, that sense of what the poem and the poet himself or herself is actually arguing. And I think that this really will be very clear with this poem, Tarfia Faizula's 100 Bells. My sister died. He raped me. They beat me. I fell to the floor. I didn't. I knew children, their smallness, her corpse, my fingernails, the softness of my belly, how it could double over. It was puckered like children, ugly when they cry. My sister died and was revived. Her brain burst into blood. Father was driving. He fell asleep. They beat me. I didn't flinch. I did. It was the only dance I knew. It was the katak. My ankles sang with 100 bells. The stranger raped me on the fitted sheet. I didn't scream. I did not know better. I knew better. I did not live. My father said, I will go to jail tonight because I will kill you. I said, she died. It was the katakali. Only men were allowed to dance it. I threw a chair at my mother. I ran from her. The kitchen. The fly swatter was a whip. The fly swatter was a fly swatter. I was thrown into a fire ant bed. I wanted to be a man. It was summer in Texas and dry. I burned. It was a snake dance. He said, now I've seen a Muslim girl naked. I held him to my chest. I held her because I didn't know it would be the last time. I threw no punches. I threw a glass box into a wall. Somebody is always singing. Songs were not allowed. Mother said, dance and the bells will sing with you. I slithered, glass beneath my feet. I locked the door. I did not die. I shaved my head until the horns I knew there were visible, until the doorknob went silent. So I talked about Parataxis as a syntactical structure where we get a lot of ands and continuation of thought through conjunctions that suggest equivalence. But there's another way we can use the term Parataxis, which is to think about the logic of sentences as they unfold over a piece of writing. So paratactic sentences suggest, may not have any logical relationship to each other, but because they're placed in close proximity, suggest a kind of logic or equivalence of information that in fact the writing itself would not suggest. So this is a perfect example of paratactic writing, where if you read across the lines on a very first read, you'll be thinking, well, wait, where am I? I don't see the causality between this moment in the poem and the following sentence. So the logic of the poem has been sheared away through its paratactical construction. So one of the questions is why? Why would we do this? So a little note on Tarfia Faizullah. So she's a young Asian American poet, and she was doing some research in Bangladesh about the rapes that occurred during the Bangladeshi war. And she did a lot of oral historical work, taking the testimonies of women who had been raped. And there's a way in which we could look at this and start to break it apart and ask some questions. Is this the same speaker? Is this a series of speakers? Potentially it's a series of narratives that if you could break this poem up and arrange them according to a kind of logic, you would have maybe 4 or 5 different stories of women who had been raped, who had experienced abuse, who had experienced some sort of very traumatic event within the family or outside the family. But by breaking them up, pushing them together, Faizullah achieves a couple of things. First of all, she suggests traumatic memory itself, right? Which is, when we think about what trauma does, it disorders time and it disorders memory. When a traumatic event occurs, oftentimes it's so shocking to us that we blank out the actual thing and only re-experience that traumatic event when some other event triggers that memory. So what it creates is a sort of disordered time. It disrupts the idea of narrative coherence and consequence, cause and effect, that is logic or linear. And so when we get to this poem, the paratactic structure is there to disorder time and memory, and it also is there to disorder identity itself. These may be a series of women, or as I said, maybe one woman who cannot arrange her memory well. I like to think of it as potentially a series of women who are then ordered logically by a couple of questions. How is it that the experience of being racialized and sexually assaulted has created a kind of communal voice that these women, though discreetly identified in other ways, actually share a kind of communal experience that makes them, in this moment of time, one person, one speaker. How is this one speaker then able to express a communal loss and a communal trauma that extends not, if you look at some of the information, not just to Bangladesh, but to Texas. So it also is diasporic. It's not also just located in one place and moment in time. So in that sense, the trauma itself travels and it starts to identify an entire group, gendered and racialized group. So here, Parataxis, I think, has a really important function. I mean, it's not simply there to create a shock value, though I do think it is shocking to read so many short sentences piled onto each other in a way that, doesn't necessarily cohere in any kind of narrative. But again, it gets us back into that mimetic space. How is it that the narrator or the reader is forced then to try to reassemble coherence out of something that feels incoherent? How is it that the reader is meant to experience that sense of disorientation and maybe fear and maybe, real discomfort when faced with a series of fragmented, jarring, and potentially very violent images? So here, I mean, if again, going back to what Heaney does, Heaney and Faizullah create through syntax a kind of psychic re-experience of the thing being described or argued itself. It places the reader through its syntactic constructions into a place where the reader experiences bodily, if even momentarily, some part of what the poems themselves are arguing. And I think that this is something that we try to achieve as writers all the time. We're always trying to ask ourselves, like, how not just how can we express ourselves, but how can we actually illuminate the subject that we are writing about through the very formal constructions of our writing. Poetry has many, and I feel bad. I know there are prose writers out there. Poetry, the reason that poetry is a better art form, frankly, than prose, just more. We just have so many more interesting formal constructions, right? You have sonnets, you have sestinas, you have villanelles, we rhyme, we have many, many sonic effects. However, these effects are not also just limited to poetry, frankly. Prose writers can use rhythm very often. There can be distant rhymes in terms of repeating images and things like that become a kind of repetend as well. But syntax is something that both poetry and fiction share. I always tell my students, when you're writing a poem, every poem has two forms. It has the sentence, and then it has whatever other formal construction the poet has chosen, whether that is a conventional construction or it is a subjective, individually created construction. But you always start from the sentence. So these questions of hypotaxis and parataxis are really crucial because they are the first sort of containers of sense and sense making. And they are the first ways in which the reader, when approaching your writing, is going to be able to enter the world and feel herself part of it or feel herself shut out from it. I want to end with one last poem, which is one I'm pretty sure almost all of us have read and probably gagged our way through in high school. And that's okay. I want to sort of defamiliarize this. And I want to point out something about this thing that is so interesting to me. So this is W.H. Auden's Musée de Bozar. And I want you to think about that title too, when we think about this poem. And I'll just point out a few things about its own syntactical structures and why it's doing what it's doing. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. And Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him, it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water and the expanse of delicate ship that must have seen something amazing. A boy falling out of the sky had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. So I'm going to speed through this really quickly, talk about what I think is interesting about the syntax in this piece. First of all, only those of you who have probably studied this poem a lot or have really good ears noticed the rhymes. But there's in fact a very hard rhyme scheme. Wrong, along, waiting, skating, wood, course, horse, spot, forgot, away, may, shown, and then green and seen, sky and on, cry and sky, shown and on. There's a reason we don't hear these rhymes, even as they kind of cascade through the poems, and they're almost all full rhymes. The lines themselves are not what we call isometric, which means that they do not have the same consistent rhythm. And you can tell that they're not isometric just by looking at them. Some of these lines are enormous, and some of them are fairly short. So we know that they don't actually contain the same rhythm per line. Otherwise, they would start to visually at least look very similar in shape. One of the reasons we hear rhyme is because there's actually a very consistent rhythm. So we can see here visually, and we can hear sonically, that Auden has in fact disrupted any regular pattern of rhythm, so that buries the rhymes. There's another reason we don't hear those rhymes, and that's simply because notice that the first stanza is actually one sentence. This means just from that alone, you know that's got to be hypotactic, right? Look at all that pileup of information. And in fact, you could even play with rewriting some parts of this sentence so that it's a little clearer. It's interesting, he starts with about suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. An inferior writer would say, the old masters were never wrong about suffering. It's very direct, very clear, gets across the same information. But in fact, by switching it around, creating that hypotactic kind of structure, we have to think about suffering first. The old masters, even though they're the subject, get buried. It's not as important as the question about suffering. They were never wrong, the old masters. And so that is a strategy that kind of goes through the whole first part of this poem. We get so much information. We are spending so much more time parsing the hierarchies of these clauses. What are we looking at? Where are we looking at it? That we lose track of those rhymes. We lose track of its own formal structure. Then we get to the second part of this poem, and the lines get a little bit shorter and stuff like that. But again, we've got another one long sentence. So this is a poem of 2 sentences, but over a really large number of lines. So we get lost in this. So one of the questions is why? Why do that? Well, I want to point you to the title, Musée de Bozar. Now, technically, what we're supposed to be thinking about is Bruegel's Icarus, that famous painting in the museum. But that's not the title of the poem. The title of the poem itself is The Museum of Fine Arts. And so what we're meant to do is actually have an experience that is akin to being in a museum. And how do we behave in museums? Well, we waddle along past all of the nice pictures, and we pause and we stop and we look at different, things in there, and maybe we catch a detail or two, but we just keep on moving. And I think that's what Auden is getting to. Auden is actually duplicating that kind of experience. We take in suffering the way that we sort of take in fine art at a museum. We kind of wander past it all the time. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is in that first stanza, in fact, we get a kind of a gallery of all of the kinds of images you would find in these Renaissance or these fine Dutch paintings. There's someone opening a window or eating. There's the miraculous birth of Christ. There's some children skating at a pond. There's martyrdom here. There's dogs. We get to see all of these different types of paintings. It's only towards the very end of the poem that we actually get to the point of the poem itself. About suffering, they were never wrong. And the suffering is Icarus dropping from the sky and dying in the sea. But we don't even get that image until the very last part of the poem. And even then, Auden takes us back out to, there's the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky. That's the thing that suffering is, but had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Once again, it moves on. The syntax in this piece duplicates that kind of dismissive, that kind of strange indifference, taking in, absorbing, and yet moving past all of this suffering, all of these moments in time. So Auden has, I think, masterfully created a variety of experiences here. The experience of walking in a gallery, the experience of perceiving and yet not perceiving pain, and the experience of sort of becoming lost in one's own life, to the point that you cease to forget the great artistry that surrounds you and in fact encapsulates you. This is a highly masterful poem. And the syntax itself is part of that mastery. And what's so funny about it is that it looks so disruptive. When I point out those rhymes, you'd think, well, wouldn't the more masterful poem pay attention to and want to call attention to the great artifice? That's not the point. The great artifice of the poem is in some ways burying the artifice, just in the ways that the paintings themselves and the proliferation of them in this gallery have buried, in some ways, the poignant fact of Icarus's own death. So I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to take questions, and I will stop sharing, but I can always share if there are any things you want me to go back to. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great point.
One thing.
Oh, sorry, go on. Yeah.
Oh, sure. One thing I've talked about when I've taught the difference between parataxis and hypotaxis is that hypotaxis can show kind of a more like deliberate or like after the fact state of mind, right? So it could be somebody who has sort of made a certain order of their thoughts or has a certain degree of control, whereas parataxis maybe has a less considered or more immediate, and yet either of them sort of sustained too long can be kind of exhausting in different ways. Do you have thoughts along those lines?
I think that's a great way of talking about it, really, because, that's what I think, going back to Auden's poem for 1 second, I mean, that's the masterful quality of it, right? The high artistry and rendering of the hypotactic sentence does suggest consideration. It suggests, very deliberate ordering. It suggests a lot of kind of control of the subject too. We tend to look at, like, if you read a Robert Browning poem, a lot of hypotaxis, and a lot of what's going on there again is this idea of a kind of artistry, a kind of mastery of the material, which there's, when we think of some of the more classical authors and stuff like that, they tend towards hypotaxis. And part of that is because if any of you have studied Greek or Latin, which sounds super snobby and snotty when I say it like that, but that's unfortunately the languages I took. Those are very hypotactic, structures. And you can, Carl Phillips, those of you guys who study his poetry, it makes total sense that that guy was a Latin teacher. The ways in which his syntax works, it is entirely Latinate. The ways in which these things go, and that's because rhetoric was such a big part of their education process, and it seeped into the poems, and it has these sort of knock-on effects in our own culture now for those of us who are interested in the poets that studied those poets. So yeah, going back to your original point there, like, it does suggest that, and Parataxis does also, I think you're really right to point out, it suggests a kind of less considered, almost toss off or spontaneous kind of personality. Notice Frank O'Hara. If you look at Frank O'Hara's poems, they're almost, I did this and I did that and I did this and I did that. And there's something false about that spontaneity, of course. I mean, these are still constructed poems, but to move to the paratactic in that moment is to suggest a psychology that's like, hey, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I'm moving through time and space in a way that everything is unfolding in front of me. I'm not here to process in any sort of sophisticated way. I'm here to experience. And, somebody put it in a question, like, when you write, how do considerations of syntax factor in your process? One of the difficult things about this, as a craft lecture is, like, this would suggest that when I'm, you go off and write a poem, or you go off and write a character study, start thinking about these things. These are natural processes. But the question is, like, when you come back as an editor, asking yourself, okay, I noticed that I seem to move into parataxis here a lot, whether in this whole paragraph, like maybe in Faizullah, like paratactical layering, or, in the Sheamus Heaney and kind of thing. Why? I mean, I think that's the question asked. What am I gaining here? Or potentially what am I losing here by moving into parataxis? Hypotaxis in this kind of thing, is that serving what I'm trying to say here? But I think when we're writing, we kind of moved, to move between these two moments of syntax as we're working. And to a certain extent, I think those syntactical modes that we move through in between are reflecting maybe our different relationship to the experience at hand. It does not surprise me that the more exciting and spontaneous or terrifying and disruptive moments tend to kind of go into, and physically, exhilarating moments tend to go into parataxis. And the more ruminative, legal, artistic moments tend to move into hypotaxis. Hypotaxis pushes us towards the meditative. It asks us to do it.
Spells out cause and effect, right, in ways that parataxis might leave us to guess. So that's another thing, how much control given to the reader versus claim for the writer.
Exactly. Yeah. Parataxis, I mean, both of them ask the reader to do a lot of work, but slightly different work. Faizullah's, Faizula's syntax might look quote unquote simple, right? Because these are very short, direct sentences. But there's nothing simple about that poem and what it asks the reader to do, which is to try to reconstruct or respond to or to imagine a communal identity through so many of these different types of voices. It's a very different poem than Heaney's poem. But interestingly, there's a similar question of equivalence. If Heaney's St. Kevin sees himself linked into a network of eternal life, Faizula's poem asks us to imagine how women are linked to a network of cultural pain, traumatic and inherited pain, and that might be transgenerational. So that still thinks about that kind of equivalence in a way that's exciting. Yeah. Are there any other kinds of questions that people might have? I mean, feel free to throw them in the chat or just, throw them out. This is an interesting, but hypotaxis seems to imply that there is one way, a right way to understand the poem. I'll have to think more about that. That's a really interesting and kind of provocative statement, because my initial gut impulse is to sort of say, you're in a bad poem in general when there's no disagreement about what it means. Or I would say a less exciting poem. Like if we can all agree on what a poem means, probably we didn't get a great poem. And I think one of the reasons is that poems, when they work really well, work in a space of a kind of ambiguity. But it is true, and I think Meredith's point is well taken, which is that hypotaxis seems to imply that through this subordination and hierarchy of information, in fact, there's a right way to start to perceive the information as it is presented in the poem, which is to say, something is related to something else in a very particular way. But I can also say that I was just teaching some Wallace Stevens poems to some of my graduate students, and they were struggling. And Stevens is a difficult poet for a number of reasons. And we were talking about Stevens's syntax, which is hypotactic. But in his hypotaxis, which is simultaneously extraordinarily clear in its hierarchical constructions, like this information seems to be more important than that, some of those subordinate clauses could equally reflect or refer to two or more subjects. So what's interesting about Stevens is that, in fact, the hypotactic structure would suggest a kind of clearly delineated relationship. But sometimes, like if you use a pronoun or a direct object like it or them, and then a clause after, you're not totally sure that clause always goes back to the it or them, and it could modify actually a different subject, the subject that even follows the other one. And I don't have that Stevens poem I could show it to you or whatever, but in that case, Stevens is trying to suggest through the use of that hypotaxis that there are subordinate relationships, but that these relationships themselves might duplicate other subordinate relationships, which has, in his case, epistemological and philosophical ramifications around the idea of the imagination and what it can represent and what it can't. So, going to something that someone else is asking, is hypotaxis more manipulative to the reader? I would say it can feel that way, but I also want to just go back to the very practical realities of writing itself. Nothing on that page, once you finally have polished it and sent it out into the world, nothing on that page is accidental by the time you're finished with it. When you first start with it, there's a lot of accident, but by the time you've started to edit and do these things and heighten the tensions, heighten the effects, the knock-on effects that these syntactical structures get, there's nothing actually really more manipulative about hypotaxis. But hypotaxis asks the reader to hold in mind things in kinds of relationship that on the surface might seem more complex. that's the best I can say. Yeah, Longenbach's chapter on syntax is really, really good. Longenbach is really, I really like his stuff on that too. Yeah. And for those of you guys who are curious about issues of grammar, this is the great, I mean, some of us were taught grammar in school, some of us weren't, some of us were taught to diagram sentences and some of us weren't. And it's kind of frustrating because it means that I think a lot of people come to poems with very different vocabularies and things like that. But if you study another language or spend a little time trying to study a foreign language, you're going to start picking up these terms really fast because you're going to start you're going to need that information to sort of understand what it is they're doing, right? Anyway. Oh, Virginia Tufts' book is good on syntax. I agree. That is a really good book. Yeah. Artful Sentences. Yeah. And I got her title wrong. Artful Sentences. I was thinking of Ellen Bryan Voigt. She has one called On Syntax in the On series that Grey Wolf does. The art of syntax. But Artful Sentences is really, really good. Yeah. Well, I think I might be done. I have no idea if there's any other questions or anything anyone wants to bring up, but there you go. 3 poems for your morning.
Thanks so much, Paisley. I really also appreciate that you mentioned that, as writers, we have natural tendencies towards one or the other, and that going back in revision, we can look at our sentence level structures as a revision technique. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Any last burning questions for Paisley? I think that there's some thanks happening in the chat, and thank you so much for joining us so early from where you are in Utah. And thanks everyone else for joining us this morning, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Paisley.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, quick question. Where did you say we could get the recordings?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The recordings are all archived on Virtual VSC website. So I can drop that link into the chat. So if you go to vermontstudiosony.org, we also have a page where we archive all of our recorded virtual VSC events. And I'm just going to drop it in the chat for you right now. It's just vermontstudiocenter.org/virtual-VSC.
Okay.
And you'll find both visual artist talks and also talks by writers and readings. We've developed a very large archive because we've been in the virtual world for a while now. So yeah.
Thank you
for coming. Yeah. Anyone else have any questions or need any resources or anything? Next month, Christopher Castellani will be our virtual visiting writer, and he will read and give a craft shop as well. So hope you can join us. Thanks so much for coming. Hi, Marie Harris. Nice to see you again. Thanks for being here, Marilyn.
I was just wanting to say that I missed you all so much. And this is second best.
Oh yeah, I know. It's definitely a second best, but I'm grateful to still be connected in this way.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for everything. This was a wonderful morning.
Oh, great. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Yeah.
But my brain hurts.
Yes. She throws all the punches.